After a phone call with U.S. President Donald Trump Thursday, the Prime Minister is now trying to sell Canadians on the idea that no new deal with the United States is the best trade deal in the world.
We're matching what the United States has done, what the President has done. We have the best deal of any country with the United States right now.
This is a direct attack on Canadian sovereignty. Let's not kid ourselves. Whether or not Canada can actually have its own foreign policy is at the heart of the most recent bluster.
An auto supplier warns he will shut down a warehouse and cut jobs. In Dallas, distributors face mounting bills that cannot be passed on without losing customers. Even businesses that turn to India for relief are now cornered as new tariffs seal off that route. Everywhere, doors are closing. Canada is not the one that is ultimately starting this war. President Trump's tariffs against you. What does this really mean for American workers? How will families feel the weight of these decisions? And what happens if the world starts striking back? Let's break it down. Major American corporations are beginning to count the cost of tariffs in hard numbers, and the figures tell a story of mounting strain. General Motors reported losses exceeding $1 billion in the second quarter alone, a direct hit tied to trade policy. Ford followed with $800 million drained from its balance sheets, while Stanley Black & Decker, one of the country's industrial pillars, projected another $800 million blow before the year is over. Even Apple anticipating the inevitable impact set aside. More than $1 billion for this quarter to cover the rising expense. These are not isolated disruptions, but signals of a broader pattern cutting across industries. The burden is already shifting toward consumers. Major retailers like Walmart and Best Buy have started marking up products, embedding tariff costs into everyday purchases. Items as basic as shampoo, shoes, and electronics now carry hidden surge charges. News agencies have tracked explicit price increases directly tied to tariff pressure, proving these adjustments are not speculation, but reality. Even coffee, a staple for millions, is no longer secure. The United States relies on Brazil for roughly a third of its imports. And with new duties in place, the morning routine may soon come at a steeper price. Economists argue that this is the moment when the American public begins to feel trade policy in daily life, not as a headline, but in household budgets. Sector by sector, the evidence of strain is emerging. In the second quarter, U.S. energy exports fell by nearly 20%. A plunge that ripples across states dependent on drilling and refining. The auto industry, already weighed down by global competition, is tightening further under the added cost of imported parts. What was once framed as a strategy to shield American industry is now translating into job losses and production cuts. U.S. labor statistics reveal that within 4 months, between 30,000 and 40,000 manufacturing jobs disappeared, casualties of higher input costs and shrinking demand. The reverberations do not stop at the border. Canada has been forced into its own reckoning. Beginning August 1st, Ottawa was confronted with a sweeping 35% tariff targeting goods excluded from the USMCA framework. Steel, aluminum, softwood, lumber, and a wide range of auto parts suddenly became more expensive to ship south. The toll has been severe. In the second quarter of 2025, Canada recorded a 13% fall in total exports, with energy exports alone down nearly 20%. Alberta, the backbone of Canadian energy production, has been among the hardest hit. Auto parts and consumer goods also tumbled, dragging regional economies with them. Yet, the Canadian response has not been retaliation. Prime Minister Mark Carney has opted for a quieter, calculated course. Rather than matching tariffs with tariffs, his government is steering toward adaptation and diversification. Canada is actively pursuing stronger ties with Mexico, its other North American partner, in an effort to counterbalance the volatility of Washington. Finance Minister Francis Philip Champagny and Foreign Minister Anita Anand traveled to Mexico City for high-level talks signaling a realignment of priorities. Their focus was on strengthening trade relations and restoring diplomatic ground with President Claudia Sheinbaum. The shift is deliberate and revealing. Only a year earlier, Canadian political voices floated the idea of sidelining Mexico within the USMCA framework. That approach has now been abandoned in favor of solidarity. With the scheduled review of the USMCA in 2026 fast approaching, both Canada and Mexico understand that unity may provide the leverage they lack individually, especially when confronting a U.S. administration that has shown a preference for one-on-one negotiations. The disparity in treatment is clear. While President Trump granted Mexico a 90-day delay on new tariffs, Canada received no such grace period. This uneven hand has only heightened Ottawa's urgency to secure its position alongside Mexico. The numbers show that Canada's trade with Mexico remains modest, only accounting for about 1% of Canadian exports in 2024. Still, officials believe there is significant room to expand. Building those connections now could cushion the blow of American pressure later. In contrast to Washington's blunt strategy of escalating tariffs and betting on domestic resilience, Carney is favoring a long game built on stability, diversification, and resilience. His approach prioritizes protecting vulnerable industries, nurturing alternative markets, and cultivating alliances rather than triggering immediate confrontation. This divergence in strategy highlights the competing visions on either side of the border. Trump has framed tariffs as a tool of raw leverage wielded to bend trade partners toward American terms. The result, however, is mounting instability in supply chains and quantifiable damage to U.S. jobs and corporate earnings. Carney, by contrast, has built his response on patience and positioning, accepting short-term pain in order to reinforce long-term resilience. The consequences are not abstract. They filter directly into daily life. From coffee beans to car parts, the policies shaping global trade are being felt in ordinary purchases and paycheck security. What began as a tool to pressure foreign governments is now tightening around American families. Collateral damage is accumulating not overseas, but at home, where businesses cut jobs and households face higher costs. Meanwhile, Canada's strategy of adaptation has begun to reveal its own strengths when Trump announced the sweeping 35% tariff package. There was one conspicuous omission. Canadian crude oil, the country's most strategically vital export to the United States, was left untouched. And this was not an oversight. Crude oil accounts for between half and two-thirds of U.S. imports. With Canada sending more than 4 million barrels a day south of the border, much of it is heavy crude refined in American Midwest facilities that depend on it to operate. Striking that sector would have damaged U.S. infrastructure and raised domestic fuel costs, a risk the administration avoided. The structure of Canada's export profile offered another shield. More than 80% of its shipments to the United States already qualify for protection under the USMCA framework. This includes not only oil and natural gas, but also significant portions of the automotive sector and key agricultural goods produced in integrated North American supply chains. Even in sectors where tariffs appeared severe, the damage was blunted. In copper, where Trump loudly announced a 50% levy, the measures applied mainly to semi-finished products such as tubes and wiring. Canada, however, exports mostly cathodes, anodes, and concentrates forms that fall outside the new rules. The result is a dynamic where headline-grabbing announcements often mask more limited real-world impact. By shaping its trade flows around products already compliant with the agreement, Canada has managed not only to withstand tariff escalation, but in many cases to sidestep its sharpest edges. What looks on paper like a hammer strike often lands as a glancing blow. This does not mean Canada holds decisive leverage. On the contrary, its room to maneuver remains narrow. The sheer size of the U.S. market ensures that Ottawa cannot escape the gravity of Washington's decisions. Yet the current moment underscores the contrast in leadership styles. Trump thrives on disruption, gambling that pressure will yield concessions. Carney counters by building endurance, seeking stability where volatility rules the day. As negotiations continue, Canada faces the same fundamental question. How much leverage does it truly possess? The uncomfortable reality is that options remain limited. Even with perhaps the most adept prime minister in recent memory guiding the process, the asymmetry in power is undeniable. Canada can shield itself in certain sectors and cultivate alliances abroad. But the final outcome still depends heavily on decisions made in Washington. That imbalance is made all the more difficult by an unpredictable White House. As one observer put it, even with the most skilled negotiator, the challenge lies in confronting a counterpart who cannot be read or reasoned with. The problem is that Canada holds limited leverage, made even harder by the unpredictability of a counterpart who defies conventional negotiation. But then came something that looked less like economic maneuvering and more like raw politics. Hours before the tariff deadline, President Trump turned to Truth Social, tying the standoff with Canada to Ottawa's recognition of Palestinian statehood. The level of human suffering in Gaza is intolerable. Canada has long been committed to a two-state solution. The entire frame of the dispute shifted overnight. What had been a negotiation over trade balances suddenly became a question of foreign policy loyalty. For Canada, the message was unmistakable. The rules of engagement could be rewritten at any moment. And even if Ottawa agreed to new terms, there was no assurance of a favorable outcome. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government refused to be drawn into a rush deal under such conditions. As of August 1st, Carney made clear that talks would not be dictated by artificial deadlines. We're matching what the United States has done, what the President has done. Canada would continue negotiating, but at its own pace, protecting long-term leverage rather than bowing to last-minute pressure. Analysts pointed out that Canada's existing terms under the USMCA already offered more favorable conditions than the template agreement signed by South Korea or the European Union. Both of those partners are now facing blanket 15% tariffs. If Ottawa had agreed to a copy-and-paste arrangement, the economic consequences would have been severe, far outweighing any short-term relief. The contrast was clear. Washington wanted speed, spectacle, and headlines. OTA wanted calculation. Experts from the Bank of Canada and political observers in Ottawa noted that Carney was trading time for options, and those options mattered. By waiting, Canada preserved its ability to safeguard critical sectors like energy, defense, and advanced manufacturing. In a high-stakes trade game, patience itself became a negotiating tool. Trump, on the other hand, favored dramatic announcements. The jump from 25% tariffs to 35% was crafted for maximum impact. Big numbers designed to dominate news cycles. But beneath the surface, the fundamentals of North American trade remained intact. The flow of Canadian crude oil into the United States continued uninterrupted. The cross-border electricity grids that power American cities stayed stable. Even uranium, a sector vital to U.S. nuclear energy, remained untouched. Behind the theatrics, Canada's most strategic exports were still moving. That raised a question in Ottawa. Had Trump already played his strongest card? When the tariffs officially rose at midnight on August 1st, the White House described it as punishment for Canada's refusal to sign a last-minute agreement. For many Canadians, it was a reminder that even close allies could be cast as adversaries without warning. The goods targeted represented a small fraction of total trade, but the symbolic weight was heavy. Sectors like steel and automotive, deeply tied to the political heart of Ontario, were hit. That choice signaled a deliberate effort to strike where Canadian politics would feel the pressure most. Some provincial leaders immediately called for retaliation. Proposals surfaced to pull American alcohol from shelves, to reshape procurement policies, and to strike back in kind. The memory of Trump's first term loomed large. When Ottawa imposed retaliatory tariffs back then, the political backlash in U.S. swing states was immediate, creating rifts within Trump's own coalition. Those lessons were not forgotten. But this time, the federal government's response was restrained. Carney resisted the temptation to escalate, choosing instead to present calm, measured leadership. Ordinary Canadians voiced frustration, but the national mood leaned more toward endurance than retaliation. After years of repeated trade disputes, many citizens had grown weary of reactionary politics and economic brinkmanship. Trump's style was seen less as diplomacy and more as theater, designed for headlines.